Welcome to Next Anatomy. Topic: Brainstem. Brainstem includes midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, and it is located in the when you study the interior of the skull, anterior cranial, middle cranial, and posterior cranial fossa. In the posterior cranial fossa, you could able to identify the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. And it connects to forebrain above and continues downwards a spinal cord below from the medulla oblongata. And its main functions of the brainstem are mainly it constitutes the 3 to 10 important nuclei for the cranial nerves. Mainly the brainstem helps to control the respiration, heart rate, and the blood pressure. It maintains consciousness, that is the reticular activating system, and they provide tracts of ascending and descending tracts. And this is the area now we are trying to concentrate now, the brainstem. And the first half, I'm going to call them as the midbrain. And the middle part, I'm going to call them as the pons. And the lower one, I'm going to name them as medulla oblongata. So how we'll be studying this brainstem is like in part by manner we will be explaining. First of all, we shall study all the external features, then followed by the internal features, then their blood supply and clinical anatomy. And even in the external features also, we study by anterior aspect and posterior aspect. So now in this video, I'll be first of all covering about the anterior aspects of midbrain, pons, medulla, then followed by the next. So now we'll try to look into the anterior aspect of the midbrain. So now this is our anterior aspect of the midbrain level. So mainly it is square in shape, 2.5 centimeters long and 2 centimeters wide in length, and above it was connected to forebrain. And the midbrain below it is in continuation with the pons on either side with the cerebral. So now, as I said, that I will be concentrating more on anterior surface. It is a diamond-shaped deep depression in the midline called as interpeduncular fossa. So now this is the deep depression. I'm going to call them as the interpeduncular fossa. Between the peduncles, we could able to identify. So for that one, we are supposed to study how it has been bounded by this fossa. Superiorly, I was been bounded by optic chiasma, inferiorly by the superior border of the pons. So now when you see here, so now the right and left optic nerves crisscross each other to form the optic chiasma. So now this is my superiorly, I will be having the optic chiasma. Now this is the pons. For the pons, now this will be my superior border. So I'm going to call them as the inferior border of the pons. The nerves which you could able to identify the optic chiasma superiorly, and then inferiorly I can call them as the superior border of the pons. Then followed by laterally I was being found by crus cerebri. So now this is one side crus cerebri and this is the another side crus cerebri of the midbrain, which is in communication with the forebrain. And then we'll be having the floor will be formed by blood vessels, and also that is I could able to name them as the posterior perforated substance, and added by some few contents are there. You could able to identify from above onwards. We could able to identify I could able to call them as the tubercinarium. Number two, on either side, you could able to identify the elevations to mammillary bodies. Then followed by the blood vessels. That is number three, that is the posterior perforated subs. So these all accounts to the contents of the interpeduncular fossa, which you detailedly study about the anterior aspect of the midbrain. And important thing to be remembered here is like emergence of the oculomotor nerve, third cranial nerve, which emerges. Followed by when you study about the anterior aspect of the pons in continuation is 2.5 centimeters long in length, as just now as we have studied now. Midbrain. So now the pons above was been connected by the midbrain and below will be connected with the medulla oblongata. So now when you study again the anterior aspect of the pons, the anteriorly it is convex side to side and they show transverse fibers and they converge to form MCP, that is called as middle cerebellar. And then you identify a shallow groove in the midline called as the basilar groove. So now this is the superior border of the pons. This will be the inferior border of the pons. I can call them as pontomedullary junction. And now this is the midline shallow portion called as the basilar groove, where right and left vertebral arteries joins together to form basilar artery. So that basilar artery is going to be lodged over here. And on either side of the shallow groove, you could able to identify the fibers are running on either side transversely, and finally they are going to form the MCP, that is called as the middle cerebellar peduncle. Key important thing is to be remembered is like on the androlateral. So now this will be our androlateral, this will be my androlateral aspects. You could able to identify the emergence of the trigeminal nerve. So which is the fifth cranial nerve, which will be going to have their motor root and their sensory root. So it's a mixed cranial which is having a motor and a sensory root. Medulla oblongata. So at this level, I could able to call them as the pontomedullary junction. So pontomedullary junction, we could able to identify the emergence of sixth cranial nerve adjacent now, seventh cranial nerve, facial nerve, and the eighth cranial nerve, that is the vestibulocochlear. So 6, 7, and 8 cranial nerves are emerging at the junction between the pons and the medulla in the anterior aspect to be remembered. So while you learn the pons, at the superior border, which was been showing a convexity, so there what happens here is like as basilar artery has lodged here, later on the bifurcates in the blood supply you will be studying on. So you could able to see the branching pattern of the blood vessels. Over here in this photograph you could identify this is the basilar artery. So now they are going to form right and left branches. So now these branches are called as superior cerebellar arteries. And try to remember another branch. So now this branch is called as the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries. Anterior inferior cerebellar arteries and at this junction, you could able to identify the location of the pond. So means when you go back to the borders, you could able to say that here basilar artery is there. I was being lodged by superior cerebellar artery. Same like us at this level, I will be having the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. This all concludes the anterior aspect of the pons. As just studied Higher up we had is the pons. So above I was being connected to the pons, and below I was being connected to the spinal cord. So now, as we are going to talk only the anterior aspects as of now, almost it appears similarly like how you studied the spinal cord in the past sessions. So there also in the spinal cord you have anterior median fissure, anterolateral sulcus, posterior median sulcus, posterior intermediate lateral sulcus. Here also you could able to study that an anterior median fissure can be found. On either side of the anterior median fissure, you will identify pyramid, which is composed of corticospinal tract. On either side of pyramid, you will identify olive, which is made up of inferior olivary nucleus. On either side of olive, you will identify ICP, that is called the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So when you see the medulla oblongata here, so now this is the anterior median fissure. Now this is the pyramid on either side. This is olive on either side, and this will be a inferior cerebellar peduncle on the either side. So now here we are supposed to remember there are certain cranial nerves are being emerging outside. Try to observe the rootlets. Hypoglossal nerve rootlets are now emerging outside at the junction between the pyramid and the olive, as it was the cranial nerve. The next followed by between the olive and inferior cerebellar peduncle from above downwards. So you will be having the an important word that is called as the ninth cranial nerve. So try to locate here ninth cranial nerve. Then I'll be having the emergence of the 10th cranial nerve, rootlets of vagus nerve. Then try to observe the 11th cranial nerve, cranial root of accessory joined with the spinal fluid. So these are all of the nerves that are been emerging on the anterior aspect of the medulla oblongata. Pyramid is produced by corticospinal pyramidal tract fibers. 75 percentile are crossed by a tract called as lateral corticospinal tract, and 25 percentile are uncrossed. There also have been crossed even in internal sections, whether we will study as a pyramidal deposition. An olive is made up of a mass of a gray matter called as the inferior olivary nucleus. An inferior cerebellar peduncle is a thick bundle of fibers which are located on either side of the olive, which are in connection with the cerebellum. And while you study the medulla, especially in the posterior aspect, at that time you will study about the open portion and the closed portion. So that may discuss during the posterior view study. So now in gross, we could able to say that midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. And in conclusion, this one photograph, if you could able to remember on a cross, will represent your midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata will continue itself as spinal cord. All these features we are studied under the external features of the anterior aspect. Posterior aspect. So now this will be our anterior aspect of midbrain, pons, and the medulla. Behind, you will be having again midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata, the posterior most aspect. In this posterior most aspect, we will be studying about especially in the midbrain. So we will be having four colliculi called as corpora quadrigemina, which are rounded eminences which are divided into upper two are called as superior colliculi and the lower two are called as inferior colliculi. So when you look it on here, so this will be our superior colliculus of the right side and the left side, inferior colliculus of the right side and left side, which are being separated by a cruciform suture. superior colliculus on both the sides, inferior colliculus on both the sides. Now the superior colliculus will now continues as superior brachia. This will continues as inferior brachia. Superior colliculus will continues as superior brachia. Inferior colliculus will continues as inferior brachia. Superior colliculus will helps in vision and inferior colliculus will does the auditory pathway. So on the lateral wall of the midbrain, as I said that the superior colliculi will continue as superior brachia and they end as lateral geniculate body, and inferior colliculus will end as inferior brachia will continue as medial geniculate body for an auditory pathway. So here very clearly we could able to identify superior colliculus with superior brachia will continue as our LGB lateral geniculate body for the vision. Inferior colliculus will continue as inferior brachia and ends as medial geniculate body for auditory pathway. And here as we had is a cruciform suture. And two important things to be identified. Superior to the superior colliculus in the midline. So now these are the superior colliculus, again superior, especially in the midline. I'll be having a pineal gland. The second word will be inferior to the inferior colliculus in the midline. Try to see there is an emergence of the fourth cranial now from the posterior most aspect, that is a cochlear now is emerging outside. Then moving on to the posterior aspect of the pons. It also forms later on when you study the CS of circulation and the cavities of the ventricle, like lateral, third, and fourth ventricles. There also it is going to form the floor, a separate title called as fourth ventricle. Fourth ventricle, when you study, again you have a roof, floor, boundaries, all will come in action. In that, the floor itself is the posterior aspect of the pons. In two-way process, you're studying the posterior aspect of the pons and also you're studying the fourth ventricle floor. And this fourth ventricle floor is extending between upper half is in the pons and the lower half is in the medulla oblongata. Mainly, you're supposed to identify the midline, median sulcus, lateral to its medial eminence, lateral to its sulcus limitans. Superior to sulcus limitans is bluish colored area called as locus ferulus, that is called as substantia ferruginea. On either side area vestibule. And this medial eminence is going to be expanded to form facial colliculus. Let me show you all those things in the photograph. So now, just now we have done the midbrain, superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, superior brachia, inferior brachia, lateral geniculate body, medial geniculate body for vision and audition. Superiorly will have pineal body and inferior to the inferior colliculus will be the fourth cranial. Same like this here also when you study. So we could able to see for the pons in the midline. So now this is my median sulcus. Then either side of median sulcus I will be having medial eminence. This medial eminence will come downwards on the pons in elevation. This elevation is called as facial colliculus. Facial colliculus is like I am going to have abjacent neuronucleus, which has been winded round by facial neuronucleus, which forms an elevation called as facial colliculus. Then on either side, you could able to identify a line called as sulcus limitans. Sulcus limitans. Superior to sulcus limitans, I have locus ceruleus, which I'm going to call them as melanin pigments with this bluish colored area called as substantia ferruginea. Then on either side of sulcus limitans, I have vestibular nucleus will be located, so called as vestibular area. Then on either side, you could able to see the formation of the superior cerebellar peduncles and posterior aspect of the medulla oblongata. Here we'll be studying as upper half of the medulla oblongata and lower half of the medulla oblongata. This will be called as an open part and this will be called as the closed part. So now here the pons and the medulla were being separated by stria medullaris. And here as usually we had median sulcus, posterior median sulcus as usually. Here we are going to have a nucleus and a triangle called as hypoglossal nucleus or hypoglossal triangle. Lower down we are going to have another triangle called as vagal triangle where the vagal nucleus is going to be located. Then we find the obex with area postrema. So with that our open portion of the posterior aspect of the medulla oblongata and also part of the floor of the fourth ventricle in the medulla is already been done. The next in the lower half of the closed portion, same like we will be having the posterior median sulcus. We had a very important nucleus on either side called the gracile nucleus. So I can call them as fasciculus gracilis. Then on either side I will be having fasciculus cuneatus. So now here gracile nucleus, cuneate nucleus. I can call them as fasciculus cuneatus. Then lastly on either side we will be having inferior cerebellar. Peduncle itself will continue the same features for the spinal. So with that ends the posterior aspect of the brainstem of the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. With that concludes the external features. So in the external features of the brainstem, actually generally the textbook oriented they will be teaching the separate patterns, midbrain, separate pons, separate medulla oblongata. Me, I'm going to give you an ease of presentation. Is like we're trying to bring collectively togetherly. First, we will be finishing on external features. Next, followed by, we'll come up with the internal features. So now we have done with the anterior aspect of midbrain pons medulla, posterior aspect of midbrain pons medulla. Do listen once again and stay tuned to next anatomy for the next video, internal features of the brainstem.